Page 479. At the request of the Intelligence Oversight Committee or Committees of Congress, and as its agent, staff members of the General Accounting Office should conduct full audits, both for compliance and for management of all components of the intelligence community. The GAO should establish such procedures, compartmentation, and clearances as are necessary in order to conduct these audits on a secure basis. In conducting such audits, the GAO should be authorized to have full access to all necessary intelligence community files and records. Section O. Chemical and biological agents and the intelligence community. The committee investigated the testing and use of chemical and biological agents by agencies within the intelligence community. The testing programs originated in response to fears that countries hostile to the United States would use chemical and biological agents against Americans or our allies. Initially, this fear led to defensive programs. Soon, this defensive orientation became secondary as the possibility of using these chemical and biological agents to obtain information from or to gain control of enemy agents became apparent. The committee found that United States intelligence agencies engaged in research and developed programs to discover materials which could be used to alter human behavior. As part of this effort, testing programs were instituted, first involving witting human subjects. Later, drugs were surreptitiously administered to unwitting human subjects. The agency considered the testing programs highly sensitive. The committee found that few people within the agencies knew about them. There is no evidence that Congress was informed about them. These programs were kept from the American public because, as the Inspector General of the CIA wrote, quote, "The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit behaviors would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its, in brackets, CIA's, end brackets, mission," end quote. The research and development program, and particularly the testing program involving unwitting human subjects, involved massive abridgments of the rights of individuals, sometimes with tragic consequences. The deaths of 2 Americans resulted from these programs. Other participants in the testing programs still suffer residual effects. While some controlled testing for defensive purposes might be defended, the nature of the tests, their scale, and the fact that they were continued for years after it was known that the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting subjects was dangerous, indicate a disregard for human life and liberty. The committee's investigation of the testing and use of chemical and biological agents also raised serious questions about the adequacy of command and control procedures within the CIA. The committee found that the director waived the CIA's normal administrative controls for this development and testing program in order to assure its security. According to the head of the CIA's audit branch, the waiver produced, quote, "gross administrative failures," end quote. The waiver prevented the internal review mechanisms of the agency. The office, end of page 471, beginning page 472, of the General Counsel, the Inspector General, and the audit staff, from exercising adequate supervision of the program. The waiver had the paradoxical effect of providing looser administrative controls and less effective internal review of this controversial and highly sensitive project than existed for normal agency activities. The committee found that the security of the program was protected not only by the waiver but also by a high degree of compartmentation within the CIA. This resulted in excluding the CIA's medical staff from the principal research and testing program involving the effect of chemical and biological agents on human subjects. The committee also found that within the intelligence community, there were destructive jurisdictional conflicts over drug testing. Military testers withheld information from the CIA, ignoring their superiors' suggestions for coordination. The CIA similarly failed to provide information on its programs to the military. In one case, the military attempted to conceal its overseas operational testing of LSD from the CIA, and the CIA attempted surreptitiously to discover the details of the military's program. Subsection Recommendations 80. The CIA and other foreign military intelligence agencies should not engage in experimentation on human subjects utilizing any drug, device, or procedure which designed, intended, or is reasonably likely to harm the physical or mental health of the human subject, except with the informed consent in writing, witnessed by a disinterested third party, of each human subject, and in accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects for Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Further, the jurisdiction of the Commission should be amended to include the Central Intelligence Agency and the other intelligence agencies of the United States government. 81. The Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Secretary of Defense should continue to make determined efforts to locate those individuals involved in human testing of chemical and biological agents and provide follow-up examinations and treatments. If necessary. Section P. General Recommendations. 82. Internal Regulations. Internal CIA directives or regulations regarding significant agency policies and procedures should be waived only with the explicit written approval of the Director of Central Intelligence. Waiver of any such regulation or directive should in no way violate any law or infringe on the constitutional right and freedom of any citizen. If the DCI approves the waiver or amendment of any significant regulation or directive, the NSC and the appropriate congressional oversight committees should be notified immediately. Such notification should be accompanied by a statement explaining the reasons for the waiver or amendment. 83. Security clearances. In the course of its investigation, the committee found that because of the many intelligence agencies participating in security clearance investigations, current security clearance procedures involve duplication of effort, waste of money, and inconsistent patterns of investigation and standards. The intelligence. End of page 473, end of page 472, beginning page 473. Oversight committees of Congress, in consultation with the intelligence community, should consider framing standard security clearance procedures for all civilian intelligence agencies and background checks for congressional committees when security clearances are required. 84. Personnel practices. The committee found that intelligence agency training programs failed to instruct personnel adequately on the legal limitations and prohibitions applicable to intelligence activities. The committee recommends that these training programs should be expanded to include review of constitutional, statutory, and regulatory provisions in an effort to heighten awareness among all intelligence personnel concerning the potential effects intelligence activities may have on citizens' legal rights. '85. security functions of the intelligence agencies. The committee found that the security components of intelligence agencies sometimes engaged in law enforcement activities. Some of these activities may have been unlawful. Intelligence agencies' security functions should be limited to protecting the agency's personnel and facilities and lawful activities, and to assuring that intelligence personnel follow proper security practices. See the committee's final report on domestic intelligence, section on intelligence activities and the rights of American citizens, page 304. 86. Secrecy and authorized disclosure. The committee has received various administration proposals that would require persons having access to classified and sensitive information to maintain the secrecy of that information. The committee recommends that the issues raised by these proposals be considered by the new legislative intelligence oversight committees of Congress, and that in recasting the 1947 Security Act and in consultation with the executive branch, the oversight committees consider the wisdom of new secrecy and disclosure legislation. In the view of the committee, any such consideration should include carefully defining the following terms: national secret, sources and methods, lawful and unlawful classification, lawful and unlawful disclosure. The new legislation should provide civil and or criminal penalties for unlawful classification and unlawful disclosure. The statute should also provide for internal departmental and agency procedures for employees who believe that classification and or disclosure procedures are being improperly or illegally used to report such belief. There should also be a statutory procedure whereby an employee who has used the agency channel to no avail can report such belief without impunity to an, quote, authorized, end quote, institutional group outside the agency. The new Intelligence Oversight Board is one such group. The Intelligence Oversight Committees of Congress would be another. The statute should specify that revealing classified information in the course of reporting information to an authorized group would not constitute unlawful disclosure of classified information. 87. Federal Register for Classified Executive Orders. In the course of its investigation, the committee often had difficulty locating classified. End of page 473, beginning page 474. Orders, directives, instructions, and regulations issued by various elements of the executive branch. Access to these orders by the Intelligence Oversight Committees of Congress is essential to informed oversight of the intelligence community. The committee recommends that a federal register for classified executive orders be established by statute. This statute should require the registry, under appropriate security procedures, of all executive orders, however they are labeled, concerning the intelligence activities of the United States. Among the documents for which registry in the classified Federal Register should be required are all National Security Council intelligence directives, NSCID, and all Director of Central Intelligence directives, DCIDs. Provision should be made for access to classified executive orders by the Intelligence Oversight Committees of Congress. Classified executive orders would not be unlawful until filed or filled with the registry, although there should be provision for immediate implementation in emergency situations with prompt sequent registry required. End of page 474. Beginning page 475. Appendix 1. Congressional authorization for the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct covert action. In recent years, the CIA has spent millions of dollars in countries all over the world for quote, covert action, end quote. Covert action, as the Central Intelligence Agency has defined it, is any, quote, clandestine activity designed to influence foreign governments, events, organizations, or persons in support of the United States foreign policy conducted in such a manner that involvement of the U.S. government is not apparent, end quote. Excuse me. Footnote 1. In its purpose to influence events, covert action is distinguished from clandestine intelligence gathering, often referred to as espionage. Footnote 2. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 1. Testimony of Mitchell Rogovan, Special Counsel to the Director of Central Intelligence, House Select Intelligence Committee, December 9, 75, page 1730. Covert action was originally defined by the National Security Council as, quote, secret action to influence events in foreign countries, which is so designed that, if discovered, official U.S. government participation can be plausibly denied, end quote. Footnote 2. Covert action also differs from clandestine collection and espionage in that the latter are designed to obtain intelligence without affecting the source or revealing the fact that the information has been collected. Resuming the reading. In the last several years, controversy has surrounded the conduct of covert action by the Central Intelligence Agency. Since covert action is not listed as a mission of the CIA in either its basic charter, the National Security Act of 1947, or in the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949, questions arise regarding the authority by which the agency undertook it. This report addresses the question of congressional authorization for covert action. It does not attempt to analyze the inherent power of the President to make covert action the responsibility of one of the executive branch agencies. At the outset, it should be noted that Congress is, in part, responsible for the ambiguity which clouds the CIA's authority. The National Security Act was designed to provide flexibility to the newly created CIA so that it could meet unforeseen challenges. Flexibility was provided through an undefined and apparently open-ended grant of authority to the National Security Council, and through it to the CIA, without any indication in the Act's history that the Congress anticipated covert action or intended to authorize it. Without any indication in the Act's history that the Congress anticipated covert action or intended to authorize it, and without any executive branch attempt to obtain from Congress specific authority for the conduct of covert actions, such as sabotage or paramilitary activities, the NSC directed CIA to undertake these activities. Until 1974, Congress did not attempt to clarify the agency's authority in this area, even after learning about such well-publicized covert actions as the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. An analysis of congressional authorization for the conduct of covert action goes far beyond the study of 30-year-old legislative debates. It provides evidence of changes in the roles of the President and the Congress in the formulation, implementation, and review of foreign policy. End of page 475. Beginning page 476. It examines the procedures by which the President and the Congress have delegated power to the NSC and the CIA, and the effect of those procedures. It illuminates the way the executive branch has interpreted undefined provisions of law. It raises questions about congressional oversight of covert action, and particularly the ability of Congress, in the interest of security, to deny itself information. The result of the denial has been to allow small numbers of senior members to exercise the oversight function and to determine how much money the CIA was to receive and for what purposes. Hopefully, this report will not only be useful to those interested in the past. An examination of the question of congressional authorization for the conduct of covert action may contribute to a better understanding of the relationship between the need for secrecy and the procedures of constitutional government. Such an understanding is necessary as the United States moves into its third century. Before turning to the National Security Act of 1947, two caveats are in order. The first and most important is that any attempt to understand the relationship between Congress and the executive branch in this area must be based on the evidence available, which is often quite sparse. For example, the Select Committee was able to locate the transcript of only one executive session of a congressional committee considering the National Security Act of 1947. Although weeks of such sessions were held on this important legislation. Covert action is now a well-defined and understood term. The second caveat is for the reader to remember that although the U.S. did undertake what would now be called covert action during World War II, the term and its possible scope were not clearly understood in the late 1940s. Section A. The National Security Act of 1947. Although it has been cited as authority for the CIA to engage in covert action, the National Security Act of 1947 does not specifically mention covert action. A review of the hearings, committee reports, and floor debates on the Act reveal no substantial evidence that Congress intended, by passage of the Act, to authorize covert action by the CIA. In addition, a contemporaneous analysis of the Act by the General Counsel of the CIA concluded that Congress had no idea that, under the authority of the National Security Act, the CIA would undertake covert action such as subversion or sabotage. Congress did intend to provide the newly created CIA with sufficient flexibility so that it would be able to respond to changing circumstances. There is no evidence, however, that the flexibility was intended to allow the creation of a peacetime agency engaged in activities such as paramilitary action or attempted assassination. Although the evidence strongly suggests that the executive branch did not intend, through the language of the National Security Act, to obtain authorization from Congress for the conduct of covert action, the record is not absolutely clear. Whether it did or did not so intend, the executive branch soon seized upon the broad language of the National. End of page 476. Beginning page 477. Security Act. Facing what was perceived as an extraordinary threat from the Soviet Union and her allies, coming to believe that the only possible course of action was for the United States was to respond to covert action with covert action. The NSC authorized the CIA to conduct covert action. Subsection 1. Textual analysis. Nowhere in the National Security Act is covert action specifically authorized. Section 102(d)(5) of the Act, however, has been cited as authority for covert action. Footnote 4. That clause authorizes the CIA to, quote, perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time, end quote. Footnote 5. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. And as a brief note, footnote 3 is missing. Footnote 4. Section 102(d)(4, which authorizes the CIA to, quote, perform for the benefit of existing intelligence agencies such additional services of common concern as the National Security Council determines can be more efficiently accomplished centrally, end quote, appears on its face to be applicable to covert action to the same extent as Section 102(d)(5. Both represent an effort to provide the agency with some flexibility in intelligence matters. Section 102(d)(4, however, has not been cited by either the NSC or the CIA as authorizing covert action. A provision similar to Section 102(d)(4 in the Presidential Directive establishing the Central Intelligence Group, the CIA's predecessor agency, was cited as the CIG's authority to engage in clandestine collection of intelligence. Section 102(d)(4 was cited by the National Security Council in directing the CIA to engage in the same activity. Footnote 5. 50 U.S.C. 403(d)(5. Resuming the reading. This clause was cited in NSC 4A and NSC 10/2, the early directives from the National Security Council to the Central Intelligence Agency, which directed the CIA to conduct covert action. Footnote 6. The Director of the CIA has cited the same section in claiming authorization for covert paramilitary activity. Footnote 7. On its face, the clause might be taken to authorize an enormous range of activities not otherwise specified in the National Security Act. Footnote 8. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 6. While the CIA has consistently invoked the President's power to authorize covert action, neither NSC 4-A or NSC 10/2 mentioned that power. Both referred to the authority conveyed by the National Security Act. Footnote 7. The General Counsel of the CIA wrote the DCI commenting on his testimony before the Subcommittee on Security Agreements and Commitments Abroad of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations as follows. Quote, as for the authority of this agency to engage in brackets, covert paramilitary activity, end brackets, I think you are probably exactly right to stick to the language of the National Security Act of 1947 as amended, particularly that portion which says that the agency shall, in quote, perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct, and in quote. Actually, from 1947 on, my position has been that this is a rather doubtful statutory authority on which to hang our paramilitary activities, end quote. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Director. Subject: Symington Subcommittee Hearings, October 30th, 69. Footnote 8. One of the witnesses appearing before the executive session of the House Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Departments on June 27, 1947, described the function of Section D5 as being to allow the CIA to go beyond its enumerated functions during an emergency. Peter Vischer, testimony, House Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Departments, hearings on H.R. 2319, June 27, 47, page 78. Resuming the reading. An important limitation on the authorization, however, is that, end of page 477, beginning page 478, the activities must be, quote, related to intelligence affecting the national security, end quote, as Clark Clifford told the Senate Select Committee. You will note that the language of this act provides that this catch-all phrase is applicable only in the event that the national security is affected. This was considered to be an important and restricting clause. Footnote 9. Pausing the reading to read footnote 9. Clark Clifford testimony, December 4, 75. Hearings. Volume 7, page 51. Resuming the reading. Some covert actions are at least arguably, quote, related to intelligence affecting the national security, end quote, as an individual in the CIA's Office of the General Counsel noted in a memorandum to the General Counsel. It can be argued that many covert activities assigned to the agency by the National Security Council are at least, quote, related, end quote, to intelligence affecting the national security, in the sense that their performance often is intimately dovetailed with clandestine intelligence operations, use the same operations and methods, and yield important intelligence results. Footnote 10. Pausing the reading to read footnote 10. Memorandum from the CIA Office of the General Counsel to the General Counsel, February 6, 74, page 1. Resuming the reading. Not all covert actions, however, have the characteristics suggested in the above quotation. Many covert operations, such as the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, have at best only the most limited relationship to intelligence affecting the national security. Footnote 11. Pausing the reading to read footnote 11. The secrecy which surrounded the invasion of the Bay of Pigs may well have interfered with the CIA's mission to correlate and evaluate intelligence related to the national security, and analysts in the Directorate of Intelligence were neither informed about nor asked to evaluate the invasion plans. Resuming the reading. As the General Counsel of the CIA wrote in 1947, Taken out of context and without knowledge of its history, these sections, in brackets, 102d4 and 5, end brackets, could bear almost unlimited interpretation, provided that the services performed could be shown to be of benefit to an intelligence agency or related to national intelligence. Thus, black propaganda primarily designed for subversion, confusion, and political effect can be shown incidentally to benefit positive intelligence as a means of checking reliability of informants, effectiveness of penetration, and so forth. Even certain forms of SO, in brackets, special operations, end brackets, work could be held to benefit intelligence by establishment of W/T, in brackets, wireless telegraph, end brackets, teams, inaccessible areas, and by opening penetration points in confusion following sabotage or riot, in italics. In our opinion, however, neither activity would be an unwarranted extension of the functions authorized in section 102d4 and 5, end italics. This is based on our understanding of the intent of Congress at the time these provisions were enacted. Footnote 12, in brackets, emphasis added, end brackets. Pausing the reading to read footnote 12. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Director, September 25th, 47, page 1. Resuming the reading. The General Counsel concluded again in 1962 that certain forms of covert action are not, quote, related to intelligence, end quote. In a memorandum to the DCI, he wrote, quote, some of the covert Cold War operations are related to intelligence within a broad interpretation of Section 102d5. End of page 478, beginning page 479. Would be stretching that section too far to include a Guatemala or a Cuba, even though intelligence and counterintelligence are essential to such activities, end quote. Footnote 13. Pausing the reading to read footnote 13. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Director, January 15, 62, page 2. While the CIA has recently stated that, quote, intelligence, end quote, was intended to have a broader interpretation than the General Counsel indicated in the memorandum, see Rogovin, HSIC, December 9, 75, page 175, there is no evidence that Congress intended the phrase, quote, related to intelligence, end quote, to cover such activities as the attempted assassination of foreign leaders. Under the CIA's expansive interpretation, even this would be authorized as the agents involved in the assassination attempt might have previously provided intelligence to the CIA. Resuming the reading. In this same memorandum, the General Counsel suggested that in order for the National Security Act to provide authority for the conduct of the wide range of covert action engaged in by the CIA, Section 102d5 would have to read, quote, perform such other functions and duties related to the national security, end quote, as the NSC might from time to time direct, and not, quote, perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security, end quote. Footnote 14. After this interpretation was given by the General Counsel, no attempt was made by the executive branch to have the National Security Act amended. Footnote 15. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 14. General Counsel Memorandum, January 15, 62, page 2. Footnote 15. In the same memorandum, the General Counsel argued that the CIA was authorized by Congress to conduct covert action as, quote, Congress as a whole knows that money is appropriated to CIA and knows that generally a portion of it goes for clandestine activities, end quote. Given presidential direction and congressional appropriation, he advised that additional statutory authority is, quote, unnecessary and, in view of the clandestine nature of the activities, undesirable, end quote. Ibid, page 3. Resuming the reading. Only the most strained interpretation of, quote, intelligence affecting the national security, end quote, would allow certain covert actions by the CIA, such as paramilitary activities or the attempted assassination of foreign leaders, to come under Section 102d5. As some covert actions are more directly, quote, related to intelligence affecting the national security, end quote, however, it is important to examine the legislative history, footnote 16, of the national, end of page 479, beginning page 480, Security Act to determine if these forms of covert action were within the range of activities which Congress intended to authorize, or whether they represent what the CIA's former general counsel called, quote, an unwarranted extension of the functions authorized in sections 102d4 and 5, end quote. Congressional intent is particularly important in this instance, as Congress required the language of Section 102 to be written into law rather than incorporating an earlier presidential directive by reference. This was done because several members of Congress believed that if the CIA's missions were not set out in the statute, the president could change them at any time simply by amending the directive. Footnote 17. Pausing the reading to return to page 479 to read footnote 16. Legislative history includes review of the pre-enactment history, including a history of the predecessor agencies, the history of the enactment, and subsequent interpretation of the act. Legislative history is used as an aid to statutory construction where the language of the statute is unclear. In brackets, United States versus Donruss Co. 393 U.S. 297, 1965. United States versus Public Utilities Commission, California. 345 U.S. 295, 1953. End brackets. Where placing the, quote, plain language, end quote, of a particular provision in the context of the whole statute creates an ambiguity. And in brackets, Mastro Plastic Corp. Versus National Labor Relations Board, 350 U.S. 270, 1956. Richards v. United States, 369 U.S. 1, 1962, end brackets. Or where it can be shown that an application of the literal words would bring about a result plainly at variance with their purpose. In brackets, Johansson versus United States, 343 U.S. 427, 1952. United States versus Dickerson, 310 U.S. 554, 1940, end brackets. It is pertinent only to show legislative intent and thus the various kinds of legislative history Hearings, reports, floor debates are considered significant according to the likelihood that they indicate the purpose of the legislator as a whole. For instance, if Congress as a whole is not or cannot be aware of the evidence that a bill would have a particular effect or remedy a particular evil, it cannot be assumed that Congress intended the statute to have that effect. In construing statutes, courts will, therefore, consider whether the history manifested in the hearings reports and the floor debates was made available to the legislators, whether they were actually aware of it, and the credence which legislators themselves may have given to it. In certain instances, an examination of executive sessions may illuminate the intent of individual members of Congress. Such testimony might also clarify the executive's interpretation of a particular piece of legislation. Now, that is the end of page 479. Returning to page 480 to read footnote 17. Hearings before the House Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Department on H.R. 2319, National Security Act of 1947, April to July 1947, page 171. See also transcript, House Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Departments, hearings on H.R. 2319, June 27, 47, pages 57 to 58. Another reason given for enumerating the CIA's purpose was that the public would not have access to the Federal Register and thus would be ignorant of the agency's missions. Resuming the reading. Before turning to the legislative history of the National Security Act, however, it is important to note that Section 102(d)(5) sets out a second condition. The CIA must be directed by the NSC to perform the, quote, other functions and duties, end quote. The authority of the NSC to direct the CIA to undertake activities has recently come under attack. Footnote 18. Pausing the reading to read footnote 18. See Committee on Civil Rights and the Committee on International Rights of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, quote, Central Intelligence Agency, Oversight and Accountability, end quote, page 13, and Central Intelligence Agency Response to, quote, Central Intelligence Agency, Oversight and Accountability, end quote, page 21. For a discussion of the President's authority to direct the CIA to undertake various forms of covert action in the absence of congressional authorization, or when Congress has spoken, see Chapter 3. Resuming the reading. The question of whether the NSC must specifically approve each covert action, or whether it can delegate its authority or provide approval in advance for whole categories or programs of covert action, has also been raised. General Vandenberg, who headed the Central Intelligence Group, the CIA's predecessor body, expressed to the drafters of the National Security Act his belief that the CIA should not have to come continually to the NSC for approval for action. According to a CIA legislative history of the Act, Vandenberg was told that the CIA would need to come to the NSC only on such specific matters as the NSC required. Footnote 19. Pausing the reading to read footnote 19. See CIA Legislative Council Memorandum, quote, Legislative History of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Act of 1947, end quote, May 25, 67, page 30. Hereinafter cited as, quote, CIA's legislative history, end quote. Resuming the reading. Over time, the practice developed that all politically risky or costly covert action projects would be brought before the 40 Committee of the National Security Council or its predecessors for approval. However, low-risk projects could be approved within the CIA. During some periods of time, only a quarter of all covert action projects undertaken by the CIA, the high-risk, high-cost covert actions, were approved by the NSC 40 Committee. Footnote 20. Pausing the reading to read footnote 20. A 1963 study showed that one of the 550 existing covert action projects of the CIA, which according to the CIA's own internal instruction should have been submitted to the special group, the 40 Committee's predecessor. Only 86 were separately approved or reapproved by the special group between January 1st and December 31st, 1962. Memorandum for the record, C/CA/PEG. Subject, quote, Policy Coordination of CIA's Covert Action Operations, end quote. February 21st, 67. Resuming the reading. In at least one instance, the 40. End of page 480, beginning page 481. Committee was not informed about a major covert action, the Track 2 attempt in Chile to form a coup. Footnote 21. Pausing the reading to read footnote 21. See Senate Select Committee, quote, alleged assassination attempts against foreign leaders, end quote. Resuming the reading. If congressional authorization is claimed, then the procedures established by Congress must be honored. If Congress intended covert actions to be undertaken on an ad hoc basis, as specifically directed by the NSC, then that procedure must be followed. As Chief Justice Marshall wrote, once Congress has, quote, prescribed the manner in which the law shall be carried into execution, end quote, the President is bound to respect the limitation. Footnote 22. Subsection 2. Pre-enactment history. Footnote 23. Of the National Security Act of 1974, the CIA's predecessor agencies. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 22. Little v. Barmy, 2 Cranch 178, 1805. If it is presidential power which is delegated, then the procedures established for the delegation cannot be disregarded. Footnote 23. Pre-enactment history is the term given to events prior to the introduction of legislation. Sutherland Statutory Construction 48.03, 4th edition, 1973. It encompasses events to which the legislation in question was apparently a response. Pre-enactment history is considered by the courts, in some cases, to be significant in determining legislative intent. The challenge is to determine the mischief which particular legislation is meant to remedy. Generally, the courts look to events or patterns of abuse which were well publicized and which congressmen would most likely know about and have in mind when they enacted a particular law. See e.g. Clark versus Ubersee, Fianz Corp. 322 U.S. 459, 1947. Thus, the relationship between poor coordination of intelligence and the successful bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese could be considered as extrinsic evidence of congressional intent in passing the National Security Act of 1947. Resuming the reading. Some of the language of the National Security Act, in particular, Section 102 D5, closely resembles provisions of the Presidential Directive, which established the CIA's predecessor agency, the Central Intelligence Group, in 1946. The CIG, in turn, grew out of the wartime experience with the Office of Strategic Services and its predecessor, the Office of Coordinator of Information. The evolution from the Office of the Coordinator of Information to the Central Intelligence Agency may indicate what the executive intended to accomplish through submission of the Central Intelligence Agency section of the National Security Act of 1947. To the extent to which Congress was familiar with this evolution and with the roles played by the Coordinator of Information, the OSS and the CIG, it could be said that Congress understood the meaning of the legislation which the executive proposed and shared in the executive's expectation of what the legislation would accomplish. The Office of the Coordinator of Information was established by a presidential directive of July 11, 1941. The directive was preceded by a memorandum to the President by William J. Donovan on June 10, 1941, proposing a centralized intelligence organization with psychological warfare among its functions. Footnote 24. Pausing the reading to read footnote 24. Memorandum from William J. Donovan to the President, June 10, 41. Physical subversion and guerrilla warfare were not mentioned in Donovan's memorandum, but they were discussed with cabinet officers involved and were felt by Donovan to be implicit with his plan. Resuming the reading. The directive did not, end of page 481, beginning page 482, mention psychological warfare, but authorized the Coordinator of Information to, quote, collect and analyze all information and data which may bear upon national security, end quote, and to, quote, carry out when requested by the President such supplementary activities as may facilitate securing of information important for national security, end quote. Like the National Security Act of 1947, the 1941 directive was designed for flexibility. The presidential directive establishing the COI made no distinction between overt and clandestine collection. Within the month, the COI established a unit to collect intelligence from overt sources, and by October, the COI had begun the collection of information by undercover agents outside the Western Hemisphere. Footnote 25. On October 10, 1941, the, quote, Special Activities Unit was established in COI to take charge of sabotage, subversion, and guerrilla warfare. Thus, a directive which authorized the collection and analysis of information, together with supplementary activities, quote, to facilitate securing of information important for national security, end quote, was interpreted within the executive branch as authorizing what is now known as covert action. Pausing the reading to read footnote 25. The FBI was responsible for information collected by overt and covert means in the Western Hemisphere. Resuming the reading. All of these events preceded the outbreak of World War II. Following the outbreak of hostilities, President Roosevelt established the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, by military order dated June 13, 1942. Among the functions assigned to the OSS was to, quote, collect and analyze such strategic information as may be required by the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, end quote, and to perform, quote, such special services as may be directed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, end quote. Pursuant to this order, the OSS undertook both clandestine collection of intelligence and covert action. Footnote 27. The assignment of both these functions to the OSS was opposed by various branches of the armed services. Pausing the reading to read footnote 27. See generally R. Harris Smith, OSS, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1972. And as a note, there is no footnote 26 in this document. Resuming the reading. In 1944, William Donovan, then head of OSS, wrote to the President proposing a permanent peacetime intelligence service. He suggested that this service should collect, analyze, and disseminate, quote, intelligence on the policy or strategy level, end quote, and that it should be responsible for, quote, secret activities, end quote, such as, quote, clandestine subversive operations, end quote, footnote 28. At roughly the same time that General Donovan made his recommendations, General Doolittle proposed an intelligence agency which would collect intelligence either directly or through existing agencies and perform subversive operations abroad. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Department of State eventually responded to the Donovan proposal. Footnote 30. The debate focused on the extent of the new agency's independence, to whom it should report, and its responsibility for clandestine collection of intelligence. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 28. Memorandum from William Donovan to the President, October 1944, as cited in CIA Legislative History, pages 12 to 13. As a note, there is no footnote 29, and there is just footnote 30 after 28. Footnote 30. CIA Legislative History, pages 14 to 17. Resuming the reading. In September 1945, OSS was disbanded amid the struggle over the future shape of American intelligence activities. By an executive order dated September 20, 1945, the responsibility for the clandestine, end of page 482, beginning page 483, collection of intelligence was transferred to the War Department, where the Strategic Services Unit, SSU, was established. Footnote 31. Also transferred to SSU were the OSS sections responsible for covert psychological and paramilitary activities. In a significant break with wartime operations, however, these latter sections were to be liquidated, leaving only such assets as were necessary for peacetime intelligence. Footnote 32. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 31. for the following 9 months until the clandestine intelligence function was transferred to the Central Intelligence Group. SSU was responsible for clandestine intelligence gathering. Footnote 32. Testimony of Lawrence Houston, former CIA General Counsel, June 1775, page 6. Resuming the reading. In the absence of agreement among his advisors, President Truman directed Admiral Sidney Sowers to prepare a plan for the establishment of a Central Intelligence Organization. On January 22, 1946, President Truman issued a presidential directive, footnote 33, which established the National Intelligence Authority under the direction of the Director of Central Intelligence. The NIA was to include the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and the personal representative of the President. Under the directive, the NIA was to be, quote, assisted by, end quote, the Central Intelligence Group, a coordinating body which drew funds and personnel from other agencies of the executive. The CIG was to collect, evaluate, and disseminate intelligence relating to the National Security Plan. Relating to the National Security Plan for the coordination of intelligence agencies and perform, quote, such services of common concern, end quote, as the National Intelligence Authority determines can be more efficiently accomplished centrally. Footnote 34. The CIG was also to perform, quote, such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the President and the National Intelligence Authority may from time to time direct, end quote. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 33. Presidential Directive, January 26, 46. 11 Fed Reg 1337. February 5th, 46. Footnote 34. The presidential directive made no explicit mention of clandestine collection of intelligence. It has been suggested that this function was omitted solely to avoid mention of intelligence collection in a published document. See CIA's legislative history. July 25th, 67, page 19. On July 8, 1946, the NIA issued NIA-5, authorizing the CIG to conduct clandestine intelligence collection outside the United States, under the authority of the CIG to perform, quote, services of common concern, end quote. NIA-5 resulted in the transfer of SSU to the CIG and the establishment within the CIG of the Office of Special Operations, OSO, to conduct espionage abroad. Resuming the reading. Although the House Select Intelligence Committee was told in 1975 that the CIG was assigned the, quote, function of conducting covert action, end quote, footnote 35, the former general counsel of the CIA noted that at that time of the CIG draft directive, quote, there was really no contemplation whatsoever of a program of what might be called covert action, end quote, footnote 36. In fact, the CIG does not appear to have been engaged in any action abroad. Footnote 37. The covert action capability of the government, which has been lodged in OSS and then transferred to SSU in the War Department, had been, in early 1946, almost totally liquidated. Footnote 38. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 35. Rogovin HSIC hearings, December 9, 75, page 1733. Footnote 36. Houston, June 17, 75, page 7. Footnote 37. See interviews with Arthur Macy Cox and Lawrence Houston on file at the Center for National Securities. The Center for National Security Studies. Footnote 38. Houston, June 17, 75, page 8. Resuming the reading. The absence of a covert action program and the decline of the capability. End of page 483, beginning page 484. Suggests that a covert action mission for the CIA was not clearly anticipated by either the executive or the Congress.